The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. On March 26, 2024, the Bank of Canada issued a report titled "Time to Break the Glass: Fixing Canada's Productivity Problem." Senior Deputy Governor Carolyn Rogers, at a speech in Halifax, said productivity is a way to inoculate the economy against inflation. The question ahead is, why has Canadian productivity sagged, and how can it be turned around? Jock Finlayson, the Chief Economist at the Independent Contractors of BC, says Canada needs to reorient policy to focus squarely on improving productivity and real incomes per capita, both of which are stagnant and falling. I invited Jock Finlayson to join me for a conversation that matters about Canada's productivity crisis and why it matters. Jock, that is the question. Why is productivity so important for us to measure and be paying attention to the elements that encourage it, and really pay attention when it's starting to fall the way that it is here in Canada?
Well, it's a great question, and let me say I was very struck by the speech. It was delivered by the Senior Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada, because the language that she used was pretty stark and not the normal discourse we see from central bankers, at least in this country. So I think it's a sign of how concerned the senior non-political policymakers in the federal government, the finance department, the industry department of the Bank of Canada have become about both the stagnation and productivity.
Can I ask you a question? Like, for her to come out and be that forthright, what kind of vetting process would that decision have? Like, for her style and tone, what would it have had to go through that would indicate that the message is now starting to get through?
Sure. Well, let's be clear. She wasn't being political, and she wasn't criticizing any government in particular. But it would be an internal process with her colleagues, obviously the governor of the bank and her colleagues on what's called the governing council, which makes all the decisions for the bank. I'm sure the speech was run through that group to get commentary, because it was to talk about a crisis, which is more or less what she did, is extremely unusual in my long career watching the Bank of Canada. That's not how they typically function. So again, to me, it's a sign of how worried they really are.
So when she says crisis, what are the things that we need to take into consideration when we go, okay, this is a crisis? Like,
sure.
What is it that we are paying attention to?
Right. Well, I think what she's referring to, or the reason perhaps they threw the gauntlet down a bit, is we're seeing a continued erosion in where Canada stands vis-a-vis peer jurisdictions on productivity. And let me just say, productivity is usually measured as the value of what's produced in the economy per hour of work. And that's called labor productivity, and that's typically what economists pay attention to. And Canada has basically been flatlining or decreasing on that key measure. We've had 11 of the last 14 quarters we've actually had a decline in productivity. That's extremely unusual. And it's a sign of some sort of, I think, structural kind of stagnation, and that's what she's concerned about. Why does that matter? It ties directly into economic growth. All politicians, including those governing the country today, say they want the economy to grow. Mr. Trudeau talked about creating an economy that will generate more opportunity for middle class Canadians and people who want to join the middle class. That means you've got to have economic growth and dynamism. There's only two ways really to grow an economy over time. One is more input of labor, so more workers, more hours worked in the economy. And the other is to increase the value of what we're producing every hour of work, and that's productivity. Canada has really bet all its chips in the last decade on growing the economy by growing the population and the workforce. There really hasn't been much sustained attention to driving productivity growth. And that's true for the current federal government. I would say it's largely true for the provinces. So we've ended up in a situation where we're really stagnating on productivity, and it's not clear what it's going to take to sort of shake things up. And I think that's why she made what I would describe as a blockbuster speech on a topic the central bank normally would stay away from.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. What I found interesting in doing just a little bit of research about, how do you measure productivity, I came across this interesting little example that said, so let's say somebody was going to pay you $45 to dig a hole, but all you had was your hands. And it was a specific size hole, and you went, okay, I'm going to take the $45 and I'm going to go dig that hole. Well, by the time that you finished digging it, you may have gone 9 hours of work, and you're only making like $5 an hour.
Yeah.
Whereas if you had a shovel, you might have done it in 3 hours, and you would have been making $15 an hour. If you actually had some kind of backhoe and you did it in 15 minutes, now you're making, 23 or 22.50 an hour. And so I start to look at that and say, okay, how do we apply that same concept to like an economy as a whole? What is it that we don't have as far as the tools that are necessary to be able to increase the total value for each hour of effort?
Sure. Well, that's a great way of framing it, because ultimately, productivity is really about the technologies, the tools, the capital that workers and firms have to produce goods and services. And it's not about standing over workers with a whip and getting them to work harder. It's about really the tools, as well as the skill levels of people working in the economy. Canada, we actually do quite well on the skills side, I would say. And this is one of the puzzles, I think, of Canada's productivity stagnation. We've got among the most highly educated populations in the world. Until recently, we had an immigration system that was geared to bringing in permanent newcomers that scored quite highly on the points-based system that the Government of Canada uses to select economic immigrants, and that worked reasonably well over time. We've got a pretty good education system at the K-12 level. A lot of people complain about it, but the studies show that our students do reasonably well, compared to peer jurisdictions on reading, mathematics, science, and the elementary level and the sort of high school level. So we do quite well, I think, on the skills. We could do better. Where we fall down is on the tools that workers and firms have. So the investment in the capital stock, in the machinery, in the equipment, in the buildings, in the digital technologies and tools, the engineering infrastructure, intellectual property, products, all the things that make companies more productive and therefore workers better paid, that's where we're really lagging. And today, in the Canadian business sector as a whole, is only investing 55 to 60% as much as the US business sector on a per worker basis in what we call tangible capital. So again, those tools and technologies that make people. So there's a real weakness in capital formation for some reason in Canada, and it's not new, but it's gotten a lot worse since the middle of the last decade.
Why? Like, what happens that we decide that, okay, we're not going to invest in those tools or equipment, and also, to your point, infrastructure as well that helps to kind of grease the wheels of the economy? What's happened to us?
Yeah, well, it's useful to talk to business leaders and investors who ultimately sort of control the capital flows to get their perspective. My observation would be there's a few things that have happened. One, in the middle of the last decade, there was a big shock to the energy industry in Canada because oil prices fell and climate policy got more stringent. So this created a challenging environment for the oil and gas industry. That's our biggest export engine. So that the weakness in overall investment, it was led by the energy sector, really pulled back on capital formation. And it's a big industry, so it affected the overall numbers for business. But it spread beyond oil and gas as we went sort of past 2014 and 15. We've had a government in Ottawa that is really committed to record high levels of immigration, both permanent and temporary. Quite extraordinary compared to other advanced economies, how many people Canada's been admitting. This has augmented the labor supply And many economists would argue it's actually dampened the pressure on business to invest in capital because we've had a larger supply of labor available to firms. So they've been able to do their business, undertake their production by sourcing more labor rather than replacing labor with capital. So that's one argument.
Isn't that almost like a false, like narrative? Because if we talk about the fact that what you want to do is increase what the level of productivity is for hour worked, but you're saying, no, I'm just going to increase the number of workers. You're increasing the hours, but you're not really increasing the value of output per worker. And
that's true, but companies don't care about GDP per hour worked. They care about running their business, getting the goods and services out the door, finding ways to service their customers' needs. And you can do that as a business through more labor, applying more labor hours, hiring more workers, or you can do it by substituting capital for workers. So at the margin in Canada, because we've had a rapidly growing population and workforce, the market signals to employers have produced different outcomes here than we've seen, for example, in the United States. Look at the US. Their immigration level is a quarter of ours on a population adjusted basis, but they're growing their economy faster than Canada. They're certainly growing incomes faster, and they're kicking the lights out or eating our lunch in terms of productivity growth. And that's partly because their businesses are investing a lot more in technology and capital than ours. And part of the reason for that is that we've had a policy environment that has put a high priority on growing the labor force as a way to grow the economy. I think that's the wrong approach. I think we should be growing the economy primarily through higher productivity, more innovation, and scaling more of our Canadian companies. But that hasn't been the way it's seen through the lens of politicians at the moment.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. So do we have policies in place that are actually discouraging that additional investment into technology and equipment and so on that are different than those in the United States, which clearly seem to be supporting that kind of investment?
Yeah, it's not as if our governments are deliberately seeking to thwart productivity growth. It's more of an inadvertent kind of outcome of the choices they've made and the kind of political priorities that they've embraced. But at the margin, yes, we have a policy mix in Canada that has not helped. It hasn't worked, right? Whatever we're doing is not working in terms of dealing with the productivity crisis that the Bank of Canada Senior Deputy Governor talked about. So we really need to step back, and it's a natural tendency by governments of all stripes to say, what we're doing is working, especially in an election year.
Yeah.
But her statement, at least to me, is a clear sign that when it comes to productivity, what we've been doing is not working. So we need to step back and retool, recalibrate, maybe learn from others that approach this, other jurisdictions that have approached this challenge in a different way and are getting better results. So that's kind of what I would be encouraging our governments to do, not just the federal government, but the provinces too.
So when we say, well, what we're doing is actually a very complex set of interplays, dynamic interactions between policies, people, taxation, and so on. How do we start to pick it apart to say, oh, well, here's something that's sort of like gumming up the gears so that it's not working as well as it could? How do we go deconstructing what we're doing right now to find a way to tweak it so that we can then start to see productivity increases?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question because it is very complex, I think. I mean, economists have all kinds of different ideas on how to get at it. Our governments have done lots of things that they believe are helpful in getting investment and productivity growth, but empirically it's not delivering the results. So I think what I would step back and say, what do we most need to do if we want to be more productive? Increase GDP per hour worked. And not every politician will sign on to that, by the way, as an overarching objective. So don't forget that. There are some that I think believe economic growth is actually undesirable because it fouls the environment, or the fruits of economic growth are not distributed evenly enough across the population, so it just fosters more inequality. So we shouldn't assume that that every elected official is gung-ho on economic growth. I would just caution. But I do think most of them care about it, including the ones in power today. And I guess what I would be encouraging them to do is step back and first acknowledge that what we're doing isn't working. And we're not there yet, by the way. I haven't heard too many elected officials.
Well, no, the warning bell just got rung.
And we'll see. Election years don't help in that regard. But the second thing I would say, what's our greatest deficiency in Canada? Where are we really falling short compared to peer jurisdictions? And it's business investment, what we call non-residential private sector investment in the tools, technologies, equipment, and structures that allow us to trade, allow us to produce more efficiently. That's the big gap in Canada. I mentioned we're 55 to 60% of the US level. I mean, our economies are quite integrated.
Yeah.
Our businesses operate in a somewhat similar business environment. We have a lot of industries in common, but overall, American companies are investing a lot more capital per employee than our Canadian firms are. So I would say we need to design a public policy mix that puts investment first, not consumption. Right now, I would say we've really leaned in the direction of promoting consumption. Certainly the Trudeau government has done that. That's been their signature piece. Things like pharmacare, dental care, child care, big budget deficits, huge income transfers to individuals. Whatever you may feel about those various initiatives, they are designed to promote consumption by households, and we've done that. And that is a way to grow the economy in the short term. It doesn't work long term. But what we haven't done is create the right policy mix to really incentivize business investment in productive capital. So we need to look at other jurisdictions that are doing better. And it's not just the US, it's Denmark, France. I mean, there's a lot of countries, the Scandinavian countries, Korea, Singapore. There's a lot of countries doing better than Canada at productivity growth and at fostering business investment. So I'd be looking around at other jurisdictions to try and learn where we can so that we can do some retooling. And the other point I'd make about Canada is, if you think of our geographic reality, our geoeconomic space, as some analysts would call it, we're the sort of northern part of North America. America is the natural draw for talent, for capital, for innovation, for research, everything. We are fighting constantly a rearguard action, I think, to get our share of the goods in Canada, because the tendency for businesses, for investors, is to locate and grow in the United States because it's a bigger market, it's more dynamic. The economic returns to success are greater. It's easier to scale, and the rewards to those who succeed are unparalleled. And we just don't offer the same mix of opportunity. So we need, in my view, and this is not a popular opinion with everyone in government, my view is it's not enough to say we're sort of competitive with the United States in this area or that area. We need to find a few key areas where we can actually make ourselves more attractive than the United States for entrepreneurship, for investment, for wealth creation. We haven't done that. But by and large, we've tried to make sure that they're not too much more attractive than we are, but we don't have a mindset in recent times that says, let's make Canada the preferred place for entrepreneurial wealth creation, for innovation, for business investment. And I think we need to open our mind to that possibility if we're going to turn around this pattern of stagnation in living standards that I think is now quite widely recognized.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. As you're speaking, I can't help but think, is this a Canadian mindset thing, though? Because we're talking about individual businesses. And, do Canadian business owners go, well, I'm not so certain about the future, so I think I'm going to hang on to my financial resources right now, just in case I need them 3 or 4 years from now. And therefore, no, I'm not going to buy that. I'm going to let that thing, whatever piece of equipment it is, see its way right to the end of its naturally productive life, even if it's less productive than the next piece of equipment that I invest in. Is this kind of where we're at? And I'm thinking about it in relationship, you say there was a huge shock to the oil and gas sector. And we keep hearing, Canada is less attractive as a place to do business and to invest in. So does that kind of thinking spread its way throughout the entire economy?
I think, it's almost a question of the culture of the country and the culture of our business community. So maybe the appetite for risk-taking, the level of ambition, the desire to grow and expand. Maybe the US market is more supportive of those things than the Canadian market because of, maybe the cultural norms, the values, the way people are educated. It's a worthwhile hypothesis to consider. If it's embedded in the culture, then boy, is it going to be hard to change, because it's one thing to tweak tax policy or retool your economic development strategy as a government. But if the society as a whole isn't in alignment with that, and your businesses are not chomping at the bit to succeed and thrive, you're going to underperform. So I don't know. I've got an open mind on it. It may be.
That's a scary prospect from my perspective, because I want to be able to say, no, it's those people in government who aren't creating the policy that's really going to incite this. We can do something about that. But as you just pointed out, if it's embedded in the culture, it gets much more difficult for us to change that as a way in which we collectively want to invest in our own futures.
Yeah, and no politicians can light a fire for business ambition. It has to come out of the entrepreneurial community. Now, I'm not saying I buy into that thesis. I think, but there are some things we could do perhaps to create a business environment that would stimulate more productive risk-taking and investment by our firms. One would be, and it's the opposite of the Canadian model, which has been to protect industries and, in a sense, regulate large parts of our economy, even bring substantial chunks of our economy under direct government ownership and control. All those things totally stifle competition. And we don't have what economists call the same degree of competitive intensity in our domestic markets as some other countries have, including the US. So I'm in favor of more competition right across the Canadian economy, including sectors that are currently dominated by 2 or 3 big companies. And I'm also in favor of getting governments out of commercial activity and insurance, liquor, retailing, utility, the utility business. There's no particular reason why governments need to be dominating all these sectors, but it's a bit of a historical tradition in Canada. And I don't see a lot of people campaigning on platforms to get government out of business. Not today.
I'm glad you brought it back to the responsibility of the government, because I actually think that you're absolutely right. We need to do things that are going to foster that kind of investment, but also foster an entrepreneurial spirit, which is hard to do when there's so many barriers to that in Canada. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you.